Welcome to another episode of the Medicine 3.0 podcast, your podcast for AI and medicine, precision medicine. This week, I'm speaking with Allison Yamamoto, and she is going to talk to us about RED-S. That's Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. And what's so interesting about this is many people don't understand that they might be underfueling or overexercising, and they're having some bad things happen because of it. She has her own journey she tells us about, and she is an expert in this and guides people in this. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. All right, Allison, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Excited to have this conversation.
Well, I wanted to start off by the audience getting to know you. So tell me how you got where you're at, knowing what you know.
Yes, it's just a simple question. So I will say that I started maybe all the way back being a athlete in high school and in college. And during that time, I was pretty interested in health in general. So I was also trying to, eat very healthy and be cognizant of my nutrition, but I was also practicing regularly. I was running on top of the training that I was doing. And then when I graduated, I still wanted to maintain some fitness. And so I ended up getting really into running. I was running half marathons, and then it was that slippery slope where you end up doing marathons and it gets more competitive. And at the same time was still very interested in nutrition. And there was a long period of time after I'd graduated, when I had started to work and manage my fitness on my own, when I started to notice things that were off about how I was feeling and about how my health was being managed. And as somebody that was so disciplined and so invested in my health, it didn't really make sense. And I was experiencing menstrual disturbances. I was noticing that I wasn't feeling as strong in my training. And the funny thing was that for a lot of that time, I had actually normalized a lot of the way that I was feeling because it was never so bad. And I think that especially for folks that are used to working out or used to exercising in any way, there's such a normalization of discipline means you just continue to push through. And under any of those circumstances, if you can still do it, you're going to do it. And I was really easily able to push through a lot of those yellow flags that I was experiencing early on. Not to mention that when I was trying to navigate the healthcare system, I would get a lot of confusing and conflicting information from people that were in the medical professional field that I was consulting with things like my menstrual disturbances, where it was confusing whether or not it was an issue or, oh, is this just normal for every female who exercises to just not have your period for periods of time? And if you're not even trying to focus on fertility, is that even something that you need to prioritize? And so during that period of time, I actually ended up becoming really, really educated on RED-S, which is something that we'll talk about more. But it was the issue that I was experiencing, which was completely a situation created by how I was managing my exercise and my nutrition, or mismanaging it is probably the better word to use. And that there are short and long-term health consequences of being in experiencing that type of condition. And so after I learned about it, I went through my own recovery, and it was not as streamlined as I would have liked because it is actually a pretty multifaceted issue. And there are certain pieces that are worth addressing as a holistic person that would have been really valuable for me at the time. And that's what really inspired me to eventually collaborate with other people who are specialists in the space, look into a lot of research that's been published over the past several years that's continuing to progress in terms of what recovery looks like, what good looks like, what causes things like RED-S, what are the health issues, what are the signs and symptoms, and then also doing my own training specifically in the RED-S space when it comes to nutrition and exercise. And so my background was sort of twofold in terms of I was always invested in the running community. I was ending up, leading group workouts, training other people. And then when I realized how prevalent this type of issue was, and based on my own experiences, that was really what inspired me to gain the expertise, but also the programs that I offer now that offer support to people that are struggling.
Well, I love the arc of your story of this is very personal to you. This is your own journey. And then now how can you take your journey and your knowledge and help other people with it? For those who don't know what Red S is, can you help us understand what it is?
Yeah. So I always kind of joke because it seems like a fairly inaccessible term. Even when you understand what the acronym is, which is Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, it still seems pretty inaccessible. And I usually like to distill it down to it's a situation where you are either underfueling and or you're overtraining.
Mhm.
And the actual definition is talking about energy deficiency, which is really talking about the energy you have available to you after all the activity that you're participating in, which is essentially just to say that you're in a state where you're not fueling appropriately to the activity that you're doing and or you're not allowing appropriate levels of recovery for the training that you're doing. And so that's kind of the simplified definition. The reason that there is a term and the reason that it is a condition is that when you're chronically in a state where you're under fueling and or you're overtraining, then what can happen is your body will start to shut down bodily processes that it views as not absolutely core for survival. And so you might think that those bodily functions are still pretty core for what you're trying to do on a day to day, but because your body's essentially compensating and trying to do what it can with the energy that it is getting, which is insufficient for what it would be doing if it were not in survival mode, it can shut down anything from your immune functioning. You become more likely to get injured. You can shut down your reproductive functioning. And so, for a woman, that's why your menstrual disturbances can be one of the leading factors that can be an indication that you're experiencing this issue. But things like injuries or frequent sicknesses are all other yellow to red flags that you could be experiencing something like red S. And the other issues are that it can also not only impact kind of your day to day experiences, but and your day to day like health from the perspective of the present moment, but being in this state for a long period of time can actually lead to issues in the longer run as well. And that can be everything from cardiovascular complications all the way through to what your bone health will look like in terms of osteoporosis, especially for women if they're going through menopause transitions. That can be a huge long term consequence of being in a state where you're underfueling or overtraining for a long period of time.
For you, looking back, you said you're an athlete as a teenager in high school, college. When you look back over your story, when do you think you first started kind of entering a phase where you were energy deficient or overtraining?
Oh, that's an amazing question. I would say that it was towards a later part of my collegiate years. And so for context, I was a cheerleader at in college, so I cheered for my university. And it tends to be that athletes, especially who are in any sort of sport where there's a body standard, and I think that for probably applicable to most, if not all sports, there is some sort of body standard. And I think that in the case for me, there's also a huge portion of that where you're on display a lot, and especially when you're doing it at a collegiate level. And so there was pressure, whether it was explicitly or not. And I think that this very much comes down to the coach and the program and the normalization, the culture on the team. But unfortunately, a lot of behaviors around trying to control your body shape or size are really common throughout our lives. And oftentimes it can be really incubated within sports teams. And I found that based on the community I was in, but also my really hyper focused fixation on nutrition and wanting to be my intention really was I wanted to eat really clean.
Mm,
And during that phase of my life when I was in college and starting to actually get more educated on nutrition, that there's so much language I think that's used around food, especially that can be really fear based,
mm,
that can cause us to feel guilty around food or feel like if we eat something, it's going to kill us or it's going to be absolutely terrible for our health. And then that led me down a path in my later college years where I started to feel like I was experiencing food in a way that was more restrictive and trying to be really diligent about what I put into my body. And at the time, I would have never said, oh, this is something where it's problematic. In fact, this is the right thing that I should be doing for my health. And at the same time, I was getting a lot of praise and reinforcement from that led it down to what you're kind of pointing out, which ended up being more of a slippery slope that ended up getting to more and more, let's say, like rigidity and maybe even guilt around the food choices that I was making, and feeling like I did need to be very disciplined in terms of my exercise. And that continued to exacerbate when I was no longer in college, and I was sort of trying to much more on my own in terms of where I was eating and how I was navigating my exercise that was much less structured.
And I'm sure that everybody's story is different. It sounds like for you, like it started kind of with nutrition, and then you said it kind of moved into exercise. Um, and I know that you work with people who are trying to kind of fix their energy deficiency and overtraining issues. And so I am curious around the nutrition piece. It seems like there's got to be this really kind of close correlation or kind of related disordered eating along with this under uh, under energizing, or not giving,
Underfeeling. Yeah.
under fueling.
Yeah.
And so how do you kind of work through that, or what did you have to do personally, if you want to share that? But how do you kind of think of that relationship versus that difference of disordered eating and underfueling?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it really is such a spectrum when we talk about disordered eating, where a lot of people know and have heard of the term of eating disorders, and there's a lot of perception and bias around what that is or what that looks like. And then all the way through to disordered eating that has been completely normalized,
Hmm.
such that the individual and other people that are seeing their behaviors may not even think that there's anything disordered about what they're doing. And I find that it's pretty interesting that even within people that are struggling with underfueling or with red S, that there are some people where it truly, truly, truly is lack of awareness. So it really is like an educational issue. Maybe they're training for a marathon. They just have no idea. They're not thinking about it. It's not a priority. They don't realize it's something that they should be more diligent about. And for those people, oftentimes the approach and the way that we're approaching recovery is very different from what you're mentioning, which is when there's a little bit more of a disordered relationship to food. And that is often when it comes into the feelings around guilt or around what you should or should not be doing and around the reward patterns around food. And there's such a huge spectrum. And I would say that for me, I can share my own personal experiences, but even in the work that I do with other people, I still see a spectrum of people everywhere from, oh, I used to have an eating disorder and this was something that maybe I never fully recovered from, all the way through to has never affiliated at all with any sort of disordered eating and would have never even identified that way. But then when we start to dive into the relationship around food and really unpack, how do you want to be relating to food? How do you want to feel? And how do you want to experience your life? And how does food play a role in that? That a lot of the times people, when they really reflect, will realize, oh, there actually are areas where maybe I have internalized things that I've heard online or things that I have heard from the way that I grew up and the way that my parents would talk about food or something like that. And so for me, the aspects of it that I found in retrospect, and at the time I never would have said, oh, I feel like I'm really disordered around food. But absolutely in hindsight, I would say that my behaviors were disordered because there would be instances where I would feel really guilty if I was eating around certain times, or if there were certain food groups that I would be eating. I would feel a lot of anxiety, or I would just feel like it wasn't healthy. And that would cause me to feel an actual guilt around eating that food. And, when we look at red S and when you look at what can cause energy deficiencies, it's funny because I feel like we're always in and a lot of, especially the fitness spaces, talking about calories in, calories out, and like, oh, you want to be in a calorie deficit, or you want to be building, or you're bulking, and like all of these very specific terminologies around calories. And oftentimes we're not actually talking about energy availability. And the amount of education that I gained when we were talking about energy availability, it isn't just, okay, your body's just going to tally everything up at the end of the day, and then do you have enough available? And I feel like that was in my brain sort of how I was thinking about it, and being like, okay, well, if I'm eating all healthy things, and I'm not really counting everything on a very restricted level, then I must not be disordered, because that was, my naive brain thinking that. And what I realized was, no, there was actually times of the day around my workouts, for example, that I should have been more diligent about my energy availability. It was actually about thinking about, even though within diet culture we might demonize certain foods or certain food groups, even, that being restrictive, for example, in carbs alone, research has shown that you can experience red S just by restricting carbs, even if you were eating enough, even if you're eating enough of the other groups. And so it was really coming back to an approach that I felt was more based on what the foundational things, and distilling between the signal and the noise. And so for me, what that looked like was, there's always, for me, I think that there's always an observation that a lot of the times when we're talking about nutrition, there's not a distillation between, this is an optimization that you can do on top of the basics once you're getting the basics correct. And once, for me, I was realizing, oh, I'm actually getting a lot of the basics wrong. And I thought that I was getting them right. And so now that I'm continuing to invest in these random optimizations, I'm actually investing my energies in the wrong area. And that's actually the funny thing about red S, is that that state that you're in from a physiological standpoint is not likely aligned with the body composition goals that you probably have from a fitness perspective. And so it's interesting, because you're right in that the nutrition was probably the red flag for me more obviously sooner. However, my background was active. I came from a place of valuing exercise, from wanting to be active. And so I think that for me, actually, the exercise component was a harder one to unpack ultimately. But it was interesting, because the nutrition was all a lot in service. I wanted to be able to perform better. I wanted to be able to run faster or longer and feel really strong. And I wanted my body to be really performant. I wanted to be able to achieve a lot, both in fitness, but also just like in work and in my academics and in whatever I was pursuing. And the red S component was actually impacting, it gets you into a state where you could be experiencing brain fog. You could be experiencing, your body is physiologically like, I'm in survival. I'm actually going to restore and try to store more fat, because I don't know if I'm going to get enough energy. So it's a very interesting situation where, once I started realizing and shifting focus from all of these optimizations and doing everything perfectly when it came to nutrition, to, am I getting the foundational elements right? What are those for me? How do I make sure? And I think that there is a level of individuality for people, but on the foundational level, there are some basic principles. And how can we focus on those things and then allow for flexibility in the areas where we can, allow for other aspects of our life to also take priority in certain areas. And that's where I think breaking apart that disordered component that you were mentioning is really critical, because it also allows you to understand that there are more roles and purposes around food, and that when you feel like you're also getting the basics right, that can still be a part of a really healthy lifestyle.
Well, I want to come back to the foundational principles, because I think, you stated that you think there are these foundational principles that we could share. Um, I think what I'd like to go a little bit deeper on is, can you help people understand? And you've mentioned some of the symptoms that people might have,
Mhm.
but what should people be watching for in themselves, in their kids, in their loved ones, as they wonder, like, does this person, do I have red S?
Yeah. Yeah, and I usually like to kind of break this apart into two different categories. One is sort of the behavioral categories, and then the other is like the physiological, the experiential symptoms, if you will. And so I'll start with the symptoms category. And so this could be feeling really cold really easily. It could be feeling low energy literally in the day, having major energy crashes. It could be brain fog or having trouble focusing. It could be a hyperfixation on food and just noticing that you're more preoccupied with thoughts of food. It could be menstrual disturbances is one major indicator for a woman. And especially if you are missing your period altogether, then that's usually a much more severe case of red S that requires a bigger set of attention, because that indicates that your estrogen levels are likely low, which can lead to other issues related to like bone density and other things. It could be that you're lacking motivation. So you could become really irritable, really moody, and like low moods. And then another one is around your workouts. So if you're feeling like you're burning out really easily, you're plateauing in your performance, those are all also indicators. You're not recovering really properly. You're not feeling very good. You're not feeling like you're making improvements in your workouts. Those are often ones that especially really active people will notice almost first, because they're hyper tuned into how they're responding to certain training protocols. So I'd say that those are a lot of the, even like frequent urination is another one. Those are a lot of the the symptoms. And then I would like to also mention some of the behavioral ones, because especially if this isn't necessarily you or you're seeing this in somebody else, it could be trouble or reluctance to take a rest day. It could be avoiding certain foods or food groups altogether. It could be feeling really guilty around certain foods. It could be hesitancy to incorporate diversity into what they're having, or eating out and always ordering, a very specific, like the healthiest option on the menu, for example, or following a lot of food rules is another one. And some of those behavioral symptoms can be leading indicators that they're exhibiting patterns that could be contributing to a state of red S as well.
Okay. And so those are kind of signs, symptoms, things might people might be experiencing.
Hmm.
And this is actually a very interesting topic for me. I have a daughter who's a rock climber. She's 16, just about to turn 16.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, like you said, there are uh, these sports where your body is on display. Cheerleading, I think, is obviously one of those. Dance, gymnastics. There are these sports like that. Rock climbing is one where you actually have an advantage if you're smaller, right? Like
Hmm.
the lighter you are, there's like this advantage. And what's been interesting to me is how much their coaches already talk about Red S, which I think 10 years ago wouldn't have been a thing. And so I'd love to hear, like you talked about this confusion as you started to unpack what was going on in your life. And I'd love to hear where you think we were when you kind of started your journey and figuring this out, and where you kind of hope that we end up as a society kind of thinking through this.
Yeah, no, an amazing point, because I think that coaches are becoming more educated on red S, and especially in the sports where, running is one of them. I think rock climbing absolutely is another one where within the sport, people are talking about it more. And that is awareness that I think is amazing, because it becomes more preventative, which is kind of alluding to where I'm hoping that we're going.
Mm-hmm.
Where we were when I was experiencing this, or when I was starting to experience this, and where unfortunately I feel like we still are in some ways, is that if I were to go to a doctor and talk about my period irregularities as an example, that it wasn't commonplace for a clinician to throw around the term red S. And
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't commonplace for us to talk about the lifestyle changes and to have support options for the lifestyle changes that are really the gold standard for recovery and for prevention of this type of issue. Versus, I think that there was a lot of normalization of either it's fine, you're really active, so you're probably not going to have a period. And if anything, I think there was a period of time in the early days when I was experiencing red S where it was a badge of honor to lose your period in certain circles. And I think that unfortunately this had a moment in running, and in females who are running, and I'm sure in other sports as well. I've worked with people who had histories in swimming and cycling as well and had similar experiences. Um, but it was almost like a badge of honor of athleticism, because to your point, in a lot of these sports, it is beneficial to be smaller.
Hmm.
And or at least that's kind of like the stigma or the expectation from either coaches or from what you see of other people that are at an elite level in that sport or organization. And so unfortunately there was a period of time where that was almost like a badge of honor. Like, you lose your period. Well, I didn't really want to be, it was kind of inconvenient. And if we that means I get to be really small and that might lead to better outcomes, then we're going to go after that. And I think that we're now getting to a point, and I hope that we continue to get this in the future, which is that we're using our menstrual cycle, our reproductive health as a vital sign to give us
Hmm.
feedback. And we're normalizing that that is actually what is going to be beneficial for your own performance. It's showing that you have the right hormones you're going to need to be able to build your bones and maintain healthy bones, and to be able to recover appropriately from your workouts. And I think that there are other areas where we can be spotting these signs and symptoms sooner. And instead of praising or glorifying some of the behaviors around red S that can be very pervasive and contagious within just like a cultural organization, especially on when you're performing within a team. And for something like running, it feels very individual because you're out there running. And I'm sure this is the same with rock climbing, right? You're kind of climbing is something that you're doing. It's not like a team-based sport like soccer where you're all very much working on the exact same field towards the same goals. And I think that even in situations where there are other people that you're looking around at that you might be training with or alongside, that instead of normalizing or praising the behaviors that are likely going to lead to something like red S, um, actually being able to normalize and praise the behaviors that are not contributing to that. And it could be everything from like the disordered type behaviors around food and nutrition to getting rid of the practices that we used to have around weigh-ins and even body composition check-ins with coaches, and the feedback around comments around women's or any athletes' bodies is something that I really hope that was something that I would observe when I was starting to fall into some of these patterns, that I really hope that we can move away from. And I think that that is a future that is possible, and that there is a world where we can start to have these discussions more, talk about them earlier, get bigger organizations involved that have a lot of influence in athletic communities. But I think that that's only a start still, because we're very much talking about sports and structured sports and sports teams where there are organizations at play. And unfortunately, a lot of the times when I do see this, it's not necessarily with athletes that have that athletic background and have the resources available to them, like a coach, like a professional, like a trainer, like maybe even a nutritionist or a dietitian that's actually supportive and maybe more educated in some of these latest research in the space. But oftentimes it is happening in people that are going at it on their own, and people that may not even consider that this could be something that would be putting them at risk, because they aren't thinking that they're at the level of elitism, and I'm putting that in air quotes, of the people that are doing this in a more structured capacity. And therefore they fall into the trap of, oh, well, that could never be me, because that's something that only elite athletes or only people that are running, miles and miles and miles, and I'm not doing that. And I think that that also can be a dangerous mindset. And so ideally in the future, we get to a place where it's not just athletic communities, but it's also more commonplace amongst people that are interested in their health in any capacity, and that we're more mindful about how we talk about it whenever we talk about nutrition and whenever we talk about exercise, that there's not so much extremist and like almost fear-based language that we're using when we're talking about what healthy looks like and what realistic looks like. And I think that that is maybe more of a pipe dream because of how much content exists and how many different perspectives exist, and how much there's so much individuality in terms of how many people relate to their health. But ideally, we get to that place because I think that um, unfortunately there is a gap that could result in if we only put this as like a athlete based issue or an athlete condition, and it very much isn't. It impacts people and of very 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 various levels of activity. I saw a prevalent study show that there were over 50% of women who exercise, just exercise, and that was defined as like working out more than like at least 3 times a week, have and experience menstrual disturbances.
Hmm.
And so it's something that is definitely not a condition that only impacts athletes. It's not something that only impacts women. It's not something that only impacts people of, a certain type of disordered eating identification. And so I definitely hope that I'm guessing that we're underestimating how prevalent this type of issue is, and hoping that the people that are experiencing it can get support as quickly as possible. And ideally, we're getting to the point where we're preventing these types of issues in future generations, like your daughter.
And I love the idea of teams actually celebrating the opposite, like you said, like celebrating, like, hey, look at how well you fueled for this. Look at how well you're recovering. I love the idea of celebrating that. With that in mind, you talked about there are these foundational principles people can use as they start to think about recovery from Red S. What are some of those?
Yeah, and the funny thing is that a lot of these are not. It's funny because I was so interested in nutrition, right? I could tell you so much about it because I was we could probably safely say I was probably too interested in optimizing my nutrition. And so the funny thing is that like none of these things were a huge surprise to me. It's not the like sexy new herbal supplement 8-step morning routine type thing. And that's also kind of the beauty of it, because at the same time, when you're going to that level of optimization, it's taking up so much of your headspace to think about all of the rules and criteria that you need to follow. So, some of the principles that I like to mention, and these are really going back to the basics. So, one is fueling around your workouts, which means that for me, especially, and I like to say this for people who are working out in the morning and for women especially, getting something in the pre-workout snack is something that we really underestimate. And I think that it gets lost in these narratives around intermittent fasting and all these trends around time restricted eating and fueling around your workouts before and after your workouts. It doesn't have to be something super complex, but if we think about that as something that's going to be non-negotiable versus trying to tune into all these random diets and trends and overcomplicating it, is something that can be really beneficial to help for recovery, to help balancing your hormones, and also making sure you have a good session, especially if you're working out in the morning, is something that I think is a really helpful foundational principle. And along that same line is eating regularly throughout the day. So, not going these huge, long periods of time where you're, especially if you are ignoring your own hunger cues or ignoring your own. And when I say hunger cues, that doesn't mean necessarily that your stomach is growling. It could be that you're starting to get a little bit irritable. You're starting to see your mood really dip. You're starting to see your energy levels kind of fall a little bit. And instead of trying to adhere to these specific time windows or anything, being able to balance your blood sugar. How are you making sure that you're getting something in regularly and that you're not waiting if you feel like you are hungry to be able to eat? And so that regularity, that fueling around your workouts are a couple of foundational principles. And then the last one is like probably the most basic one, which is to not cut out any of the major food groups. And so I think this looks, and the interesting thing is that this looks so different. It's so person specific. But I mentioned carbs earlier, and that's one that I see really frequently, but really focusing on allowing a place for all the different food groups. I think for certain people, it's fats. For certain people, it's carbs. For certain people, they're unknowingly not eating enough proteins. And I think that that's one where it's pretty low hanging fruit, and you don't even necessarily have to count your macros. That's not what I'm saying, as much as if you have an aversion or you feel like one of the food groups is really one of the macros especially is going to like lead to weight gain or be really bad if you eat it, or it's going to lead to bad health outcomes or bad changes in your body, that's where we can end up in situations where we're under eating on something. And especially if you're active, you're likely underestimating how much you need in each of those macro groups. And so that's the other one that I always like to start with people, which is it's pretty easy to tell from talking to someone and just starting to ask them questions about what their day looks like to know whether or not they're intentionally or unintentionally underfueling in one of the specific macros. And so going back to like those, let's get those things correct and let's get those things in order before we're going into random supplement routines and these other things that can be beneficial, but they're not going to be the game changer if we're vastly missing the mark in terms of what energy availability looks like throughout the day.
Yeah, I think so often people are bending over to pick up pennies when they're leaving dollars on the ground, which, they're just not doing the foundational things like you said. And obviously menstrual dysregulation is really, it's nice to have a red flag. It's nice to say, hey, listen, this is a red flag. This isn't a yellow flag. This is a red flag. If you're having menstrual dysregulation, this is a red flag. Let's do something about it. And we talked about kind of foundational principles for nutrition. I'm curious, what kind of foundational principles do you have around recovery and exercise?
Yes, and this one is so important because and I mentioned this before, but this was the harder part for me was the exercise component. And I had definitely developed a reliance, if you will, on exercise, and some people might call it an addiction, and that term can work as well. But to the point where I would get pretty anxious if let's say I needed to take a few days off and take a few rest days. That would have caused me a lot of anxiety. And if I got injured, that was a big issue. That would be a very, very big issue. And there were times where I'd even not appropriately recover from injury and give myself rest and take days off from working out because I was reliant on it to give me a sense of feeling like I had achieved something throughout the day. And so I would say that when it comes to exercise, one thing that I always like to remind myself and everyone I work with, but also in general, is that recovery is part of fitness. It's part of exercise. And so whether that means that you're doing a higher intensity workout and you're doing sessions within that workout where you have moments of recovery, that could be recovery. It could mean that you're never stacking multiple high intensity hit style workouts back to back to back. And I think it's super interesting because this is where I think the conversation around who the athlete is, and I'm being very inclusive in terms of the athlete definition here, is that sometimes when we're going to these group fitness classes or we're doing these workout classes that are pre-programmed, it's a very short-sighted approach to how we're programming our fitness, in the sense that maybe it wasn't intended for you to do that exact same high intensity interval workout every single day of the week, or like even 5 days in a row. Your body isn't going to be able to adapt appropriately, and it wasn't really meant to be doing, let's say, like a high intensity spin workout back to back to back to back. And so recovery can also look like, how are we thinking about workouts over the course of the week that we're allowing for appropriate levels of recovery. And I think it's also being able to tune in and adjust your workout according to how you're feeling. And this, I think, is the one that was the hardest for me to wrap my mind around. And one of the things that I think is one of the biggest learnings that people gain from actually developing a little bit more cognition around this. And this could be anything from using a more feelings based system, so being able to determine, well, how do I feel in the workout today? And how can I adjust accordingly so that I'm not expecting myself just to look at the data metrics and hold myself accountable to those no matter what. And that could be anything from, well, you have this certain session planned and it's at a certain pace or a certain speed, or a certain duration, and you're going to adhere to it no matter what. But being able to say, hey, so you know what? I worked really late. I didn't get that much sleep. I'm waking up and I'm probably not feeling my best. Maybe I'm really stressed out and I'm just noticing I'm getting fatigued faster, and how can I make adjustments to create space to respond to those cues that my body is telling me about versus punishing myself and saying, oh, well, I knew that I could do this workout last week, and I'm therefore going to be really disappointed in myself if I don't achieve that exact same thing today. And I think that that level of flexibility can be really powerful as well in terms of giving your body the space that it needs to be able to work out in a way that's going to match what is showing up for you physiologically that day.
Yeah, I think that ability, it's interesting as we learn to listen to our bodies kind of across the board, and being willing to actually trust ourselves that our bodies will guide us in how we exercise, how we eat, like all those different ways. It is just so hard sometimes to actually learn that skill of listening to yourself, listening to your body. I'm curious how you've kind of learned to do that yourself and how you try to guide others to do that.
Yes, this is such a good point because I think that it's so interesting how many times we hear sort of like that narrative of like, just listen to your body, just listen to it. And what we don't often talk about is that that can be a really, really, really challenging thing, especially when you've gone a long period of time where you condition yourself not literally to explicitly not listen to your body. And it becomes a very interesting place that I think is continues to be pretty challenging for a lot of people, especially who are active, because how there is a spectrum between where is the pain good and productive, and where is it now entering a point where it's actually not super productive. Because in some ways, you do definitely want to still be able to challenge yourself. So you don't want to say listening to your body just means that you're always feeling really good and you're always feeling a 10 out of 10. But you also want to be able to adapt and have flexibility and know, oh, okay, when to your point, what are the yellow flags so that we don't actually get to the red flags point. And so I think this can look like a lot of things, and I think that sometimes we get under the guise of listening to your body means that every single decision is completely in the moment, meaning that it's so unstructured and you're just going out, and I walk outside my door and I'm just like, well, I could be doing anything today, like I'm just going to listen to my body, and that could be anything from yoga to a high intensity run. I'm just going to make the decision in the moment, and same with every single meal, it's just going to listen to my body. And I think that that actually does a disservice because there are some areas, and when I go back to, these foundational principles, it's like, yeah, listening to your body could mean, look, I'm not going to be eating for another few hours because I have so many back-to-back commitments that or maybe I'm going to be in commuting or in transit and I'm not going to know what my options are going to be. And so sometimes that can look like I'm going to have something now, even though I'm not necessarily super hungry. And sometimes listening to your body does mean, yeah, I generally have this type of training program. I know what I'm going to be doing throughout the course of the week. And I know that actually allows for what I've noticed in patterns in terms of what my body needs for recovery. And I'm going to follow those principles, and there will be flexibility within that, but there's still structure and there's still framework. And I think that, especially for someone like me, who I do appreciate some level of structure, I do appreciate, I would experience extreme decision fatigue if every single meal and every single workout was a complete intuitive experience about anything that I could be doing. And so I think there's some areas where, one, acknowledging that it's a hard journey, that it's not something that you do on day one. And especially if you're coming from an energy deficit, it's not something you should be doing on day one. The first part of the process is getting to the point where you are energy restored, because being in a place where you are in an energy deficit, your hunger cues are off, they're not signaling appropriately. And even then there are going to be some, I mean, it's messing with your psychology, it's messing with so many different areas that we underestimate, that we intentionally should not be listening to our body in the way that we might imagine that to look like during that time, and following something that's slightly more structured. But then over time, being able to develop in some of these principles around how do we assess what those signals look like? How do we create a general regimen and habits around these foundational principles? And then we can get to a point, especially once we're unpacking some of these more disordered maybe thoughts, more of these disordered behaviors and beliefs that can be like pretty hard to unpack and to rewire. But once we get through that, and I think that that's why I think that the very comprehensive approach is really effective and why I've seen it produce really beneficial results, is that oftentimes just approaching the nutrition, just approaching the exercise, and all in isolation, or approaching the nutrition, but not actually approaching the beliefs behind, the mindset behind, so how you're relating to the nutritional decisions that you're making. That's what leads to way stickier change and leads to more kind of like effective resolution in terms of preventing you from going back to some of those places, and it not feeling so hard like you're going against the grain, but actually developing a way that feels easier over time. And so going along that journey is a process where you don't start with listen to your body on day one. You start with let's get the foundational parts right. Let's get you energy restored. Then let's start to understand what that routine will look like for you and to really tune into what those feedback loops look like. And then let's get to a place where you know how to pick up those things on your own. You know that you can trust your body and that you can make adjustments and that that's not going to be some bad scenario. And then that's when you get to a place where you actually are like, developing a lot more of that fluidity, but absolutely acknowledging that listening to your body is something that is a journey, and it's not something that's super easy, and it's not just something that can be told to somebody and it's something that you can action on overnight. And I think that that is the other extreme that can also do a disservice, which is putting someone in a place where they're expected to be completely intuitive too soon, or expected to do that and it should be something that they could easily action upon, can also be doing a disservice just as much as telling someone that every single decision in the day has to be based on a set of rules and criteria.
Yeah, I think that, the two things that you mentioned that I think are key is the holistic view. Like this, humans are complicated. We're not just one thing. It's really hard to take one piece out, fix it, and put it back in, because it's a whole system. A human is a whole system. And then the second piece about that, it's more about progress than perfection. It's these little steps, and you make progress. And you spoke about kind of working with people holistically. I'd love for you to just tell the audience, where can they find you, where can they follow you, how can they learn more about you?
Yeah, so the best way would be, I love to chat with people on Instagram, and it's just at Allison Yamamoto, which is my full name. And so if you ever have any thoughts, or you want to share your story, or you have questions, or you're uncertain about something, or just want to chat, I would love to hear. I love to message with folks. But then also, if you're interested in working together or on one of the programs that I offer, then you can go to theallymethod.com, and I'm sure I can provide a link to that. But there are some free resources there that are worth checking out, or you can go to book an initial call, and that can get started in terms of seeing what would be a really good fit and how we can support you.
Awesome. Allison, thank you so much for your expertise, your passion, and your willingness to go through this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a great time.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to another episode of Medicine 3.0. We make this podcast so that you know where to turn for good information on keeping you and your loved ones healthy. Feel free to check us out at bionichealth.com, where we can help you live a longer, happier life.